Kia ora everybody, welcome to part 2 of our cardiorespiratory system. This week we're going to look at lung capacities, so looking at volumes of air that we can take in and breathe out. And the second part we will look at structures of the heart and how blood flows through the heart. As a recap, the respiratory system provides the body with oxygen, gets rid of carbon dioxide, and this also actually is part of the process is helping us regulate our blood pH levels. Gas exchange occurs in the air sacs of our lungs, called our alveoli, and at the capillary beds around the body. So our external respiration is between the lungs and the blood, and our internal respiration is between our blood and our cells, or our body's tissues. Without oxygen, cells would eventually die. Too much carbon dioxide in the blood would cause pH to become really acidic, and this can interfere with cellular function. Here's a reminder of the key component of how we get air in and air out, so pulmonary ventilation, and this is the question and the model that we're looking at for the long answer question for the first part of the cardiorespiratory system. And if you remember, this is Boyle's law, and as volume or space gets bigger, pressure goes down. As volume or space gets smaller, pressure goes up. There's an inverse relationship or opposite relationship between these two variables. If you can create a gradient where there is a difference in pressure from one space to the other, then air will flow from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So we can create this environment inside our thoracic cavity, which causes us to either expel air or inspire air. Breathe air out, breathe air in. So capacity, the term capacity means how much can we hold. So pulmonary, remember that term means lungs. Capacity meaning how much can we hold. Pulmonary capacity is how much air moves in and out of the lungs under different conditions, and this can be affected by physical size. Someone with a bigger thoracic cavity, bigger lung capacity, is going to be able to take on more air and get rid of more air. Your age can determine pulmonary capacity, gender, and physical conditions. So these different variables can affect our pulmonary capacity. So our first one to think about is a tidal volume. Now I think of the tide, so the ocean, water rushing in, water rushing out on that continual kind of basis. So tidal volume in context to our lungs is the amount of air that moves in and out of the lungs during normal quiet breathing. So as I sit here and breathe in and out, there's approximately 500 mils or half a litre of air coming in and going out, and that's my tidal volume, so my normal relaxed breathing. Then we have these reserve volumes. So reserve means what we have put away or put aside that we can tap into if we need to. Inspiratory reserve volume, so that's the reserve volume during inspiration or breathing in, is the amount of air we can inhale forcibly after normal inhalation. So if I take a normal breath in, it's the amount of air that I can take on further from this point. So if I take a deep breath, a normal breath in, and then breathe in deep, that amount of air is my inspiratory reserve volume. And expiratory reserve volume is the amount of air at the end of a normal exhalation. So if I breathe out normally, it's how much I can breathe out forcefully. That's approximately 1,200 mils or 1.2 liters. So recap, inspiratory reserve volume is the amount of air I can breathe in forcibly at the top of a normal inhalation, so normal tidal inhalation, and then expiratory reserve volume is what's left at the end of a normal exhalation or breathing out. Residual volume is the amount of air that remains in the lungs even after a forceful exhalation. So there's always a little bit of air in your lungs or in each alveolus so that they don't collapse in on themselves. So this residual volume keeps alveoli inflated, and it's about 1.2 liters or 1,200 mils. And then vital capacity is the total amount of air that can be exchanged. So this is all of your total lung volume, so the most amount of air that can be taken on by your lungs, minus that residual volume, so that air is always in the lungs. So we can work out your vital capacity by looking at your inspiratory reserve volume plus your tidal volume plus your expiratory reserve volume, and it's about 4.8 litres in young healthy males. That can go down as you get older. That can be lower for females. And respiratory capacities can be used by measured by a spirometer, which are those, some of you may have used them as cylinder things that you blow in and measures these different volumes. We're going to play around with some balloons in the tutorial to visually look at how much air each of these different capacities can hold. Here is a bit of a infographic of these different pulmonary capacities. This line here, this small wiggly line, represents tidal volume, so it's fluctuating in that yellow band, and it's around 500 mils. The first big spike is your tidal volume plus your inspiratory reserve, so taking a deep breath in, and then it dips all the way down to the bottom, which is taking a full exhalation down into tapping into your expiratory reserve, and then back to tidal volume. So if I was to show you what that would look like as a breath, it would be just normal breathing. We're going to look at this graph in our tutorials as well and get a good understanding using balloons around these different volumes. Okay, part 2 is looking at the cardiovascular system, specifically the heart structure. Last week we looked at blood and blood vessels. Today it's all about the heart. Recap: cardiovascular system delivers that oxygen that is brought in by the lungs. It also delivers nutrients, hormones, and carries wastes away, such as carbon dioxide. This is all done by our blood, but the heart pumps blood throughout the body in these blood vessels. Blood flow requires both the pumping action of the heart and changes in pressure. So more pressure means more blood flow, less pressure means less blood flow. At different situations we will need more pressure and less pressure. If cardiovascular system could not perform its functions, then waste would build up in tissues, body organs would fail to function properly, and then once oxygen becomes depleted, cells start to die. So we're looking at the third component of the cardiovascular system. As I said, we looked at blood last week, blood vessels, and this week is all about the heart, and it's our body's pump, moves blood around the cardiovascular system inside our blood vessels. This diagram just shows you location, sits center, but it's got a pointy end, and that pointy end sits slightly to your left. So whenever you're looking at a diagram like this, what you see is opposite. So the left side of the heart is as if you were facing away. So just be careful when you look at diagrams that your right side is actually the left side of the heart. We will practice labeling hearts over and over, because that will be something that is examined. Okay, so we can look at the structures of the heart in terms of the walls. Here we have a zoomed up version of a piece of the left atrium. Inside the bottom here we've got the heart chamber. Pericardium is a type of connective tissue that creates this double layer of connective tissue around the heart. Epicardium is the same kind of tissue. Myocardium is that cardiac muscle tissue which contracts to create movement. And then endocardium is also a type of connective tissue. Inside this pericardium, this double bilayer of connective tissue, you'd have some fluid, so that when the heart beats and moves around, it reduces the amount of friction. Okay, I've got different diagrams of different spaces of the heart. So first we're going to look at the chambers. Left atrium, the atria are always at the top. So left atrium, we come down to the left ventricle. Blood always comes into the atrium and from outside of the body. And then your ventricles always pump blood out. So atrium, blood in, ventricles, blood out. And the left side always deals with oxygenated blood. So that's why this left ventricle muscle wall is quite thick, because it's pumping oxygenated blood around the body. On the other side, we have our right atrium and our right ventricle. So this side of the heart deals with deoxygenated blood, or blood that's coming from the body, and this ventricle wall isn't as thick because it's going to send its blood to the lungs, which are just next door, so it doesn't need as much force to get to where it's going. So if we look at the blood vessels, this is where it can get a little bit confusing, but they do all make sense. So remember that veins always bring blood in. So here we have the pulmonary veins, pulmonary meaning lungs, vein meaning blood in. So this is explaining that we've got blood coming from the lungs into the heart. If it's coming from the lungs, it means that the blood must have oxygen, because it's just been to pick up oxygen at the lungs. And we know that the left side of the heart deals with oxygenated blood, therefore pulmonary veins bring blood into the left atrium, because blood always comes into the atrium. The aorta is our main blood artery. So arteries carry blood away. It's our main one. It receives blood exiting the left side of the heart because it has oxygenated blood, and it's about to head off towards all the body's different cells that need oxygen. It's got thick walls, it's got a lot of pressure, it's the main artery receiving blood from the left ventricle that has oxygen. On the other side we have superior vena cava, inferior vena cava. This is also a vein as it brings blood in. This is blood that's come back after delivering oxygen, so it's now depleted of oxygen but has high concentrations of CO2, so it's deoxygenated blood. It's coming in either from the top half of the body or the lower half. So depending on where the blood's coming from, it'll either enter the superior vena cava from the top or inferior vena cava from the bottom, and that blood enters that right atrium. And then the right ventricle will pump blood out of the pulmonary artery. So this is deoxygenated blood. It needs oxygen, so it's going to the lungs. So that's where we get the pulmonary word, and then artery meaning the blood is leaving the heart. So deoxygenated blood leaving the heart on the way to the lungs through our pulmonary arteries, and you'll see they split off into left and right because we have left and right lungs. The valves, as with veins, the heart has valves, one-way valves, which allow blood to flow through and then to stop backflow. So first up, we have our what we call our AV valves. AV stands for atrioventricular, which means between the atrium and the ventricles. So they stop backflow of blood leaving the ventricles, going back into the atrium, because you don't want blood going back into those chambers they've just come from. The AV valve on the right-hand side, or between the right and left, right atrium and left ventricle, is called a tricuspid valve. And on the left-hand side, a bicuspid valve. And I think it's to do with these cords and how many strands there are. And then we have our pulmonary semilunar valve and our aortic semilunar valve. So these valves, they almost look like half moons. They allow blood to come up through the two different arteries, so the aorta and the pulmonary artery, and then they stop blood from falling back down into the ventricles. I just think of lunar, sounds like moon. These are sort of semicircle shaped like a moon. The lub-dub is giving you an idea of the heart sound. When you listen to your heart, you hear boom, 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 or lub-dub, lub-dub. That sound is coming from the physical action of those valves shutting. So when you hear heart sounds, it's the physical action of these valves being shut. Alright, so being able to label this heart is a big part of understanding the cardiovascular system, part 2. So superior vena cava, pulmonary artery, because blood is being carried away, right atrium, pulmonary veins. So these veins are actually coming in through the back and bringing blood into the left atrium. We've got our pulmonary semilunar valves. We have our AV valves, and on the right side is our tricuspid valve. These little strings are called the heartstrings. So you've heard the saying, tugging at my heartstrings. Well, physically, that is the strings that hold these AV valves open, so that when the ventricles contract, they actually have so much pressure that they shut these valves. But these cords pull that valve open as soon as the ventricles relax, and blood can just, through gravity mostly, drop from your atrium down into your ventricles. So we've got right ventricle, and then they're called, your heartstrings are called chordae tendineae. Inferior vena cava at the bottom, receiving deoxygenated blood from the lower half of the body. Our main artery carrying oxygenated blood away is our aorta. Then we have our pulmonary arteries, so carrying deoxygenated blood away from the heart to the lungs. Then we have our left pulmonary veins, bringing oxygenated blood into the left side of the heart, which we know always has oxygenated blood. Left atrium, our aortic semilunar valves, our right atrioventricular valves, or our right AV valves, bicuspid, left ventricle, and then the middle muscle wall is called the septum. You may have heard of babies being born with holes in their hearts. This is where the holes can be, and depending on how inferior that hole is, will dictate sort of how bad that is. Everyone is born or has that hole in their heart, so that blood can shunt across ventricles, because in utero the baby isn't breathing their own oxygen, so their blood has been oxygenated by mum, so it doesn't go through to the lungs phase, not until they're born, and that hole should close up, but it doesn't always. So now we're going to talk about blood flowing through the heart. So this is our cardiac cycle, sequence of events from the beginning of one heartbeat to the beginning of the next. So what happens in that contract, relax state? So as you know, through last week, we have two ventricular phases, so phases of the ventricles: systolic, which is our high pressure phase, which is when the ventricles contract and spit blood out, and then diastolic, which is when the ventricles relax and fill with blood, and that's when the pressure drops. Just like lung capacities, we can measure different volumes within the heart. So stroke volume is the amount of blood that comes out of the left ventricle, or out of each ventricle when they contract, and it's around 70 mils. Obviously that can change from person to person, but it's around 70 mils. That's your stroke volume. Cardiac output is how much blood is pumped out of the heart in 1 minute. So if you take your stroke volume, multiply it by your resting heart rate, or your heart rate at any one time, that will give you your cardiac output at any one time. Okay, heart rate, as we know, number of cardiac cycles per minute. So we can measure that. It's measured in beats per minute, so 60 seconds. The average resting heart rate of an individual is around 60 to 80, depending on things like fitness, when you take that measure, if you're lying down, sitting up, what you've eaten, so nutrition, your stress levels, sleep, all that kind of stuff. Tachycardia is a rapid heart rate over 100 beats per minute at rest. So obviously during exercise, heart rate's going to go up. It doesn't mean you're tachycardic, it just means you're exercising. And bradycardia is a slow heart rate, so less than 60 beats per minute. And trained individuals, endurance trained individuals, are likely to have resting heart rates below 60 beats per minute. So here's just a little infograph of the different factors that feed into what triggers heart rate and what triggers stroke volume. Thinking about overall cardiac output, which is the amount of blood ejected from the heart in a minute. There are many reasons why you might need to increase cardiac output, and this just gives you an idea of what's happening. So heart rate, you've got autonomic innervation, so that's your nervous system that isn't consciously controlled by you. Hormones can change heart rate. Your fitness levels can change heart rate at different situations, same with your age. And then factors that affect the amount of blood pumped out per contraction, how big your heart is or how big your left ventricle is. Fitness levels, gender, males have a bigger left ventricle than females on average. Contractility is to do with the condition of the muscle, heart muscle tissue. Duration of contraction, so how long a contraction lasts. Preload and afterload resistance. So these are all to do with conditions of heart tissue. You won't need to know all of these, but just know some of the general ones like hormones, fitness level, age, heart size, fitness levels, gender. That's our main sort of areas to think about. And the equation for cardiac output is simply heart rate times stroke volume, and we'll calculate some of this in the tutorial. Okay, blood flow through the heart. Here is 2 rules that will help you remember or understand this. The right side of the heart always receives or deals with deoxygenated blood, so blood that has had oxygen removed because the cells have used them. It'll have high concentrations of CO2, and it's the side of the heart that is trying to get blood back to the lungs. The left side of the heart receives oxygenated blood. It's blood that's coming from the lungs and pumps to the body's tissues to deliver O2. So left side, pick up O2, right side, deliver O2. Let's look at the cardiac cycle. From the lungs, blood comes in, so it's got oxygen. Blood comes in via our pulmonary vein, pulmonary meaning lung, vein meaning in. Our AV valves will open when there's less pressure. Gravity will feed that blood down into your left ventricle. Left ventricle will contract. Blood will leave the aorta, so the artery carrying oxygenated blood away, off to the body. The body cells, the body's tissues. Deoxygenated blood, which needs oxygen, is now entering the superior and inferior vena cava into the right atrium. That blood's then going to drop down into the right ventricle. That ventricle will contract, head off through the pulmonary arteries, either left or right, to the lungs. So this is all happening together. So we've got blood coming from the lungs into the left atrium. We've got blood coming from the body into the right atrium. When the ventricles are filling or relaxed, our diastolic, blood drops from the left and right atrium down into the left and right ventricle. Ventricles contract, eject blood to go to the body via the aorta or to the lungs via the pulmonary arteries, off to the body, off to the lungs. So this is all happening, every single contract, relax, contract, relax. Okay, now we can look at different spaces of circulation. So we've got the pulmonary circulation, and as we've said a few times, pulmonary means lungs. So this is our lung circulation. So it's a portion of the cardiovascular system which carries deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs to be picked up, to pick up oxygen back to the heart. So it's a pickup system. Pulmonary circulation is heart, lungs, lungs, heart. There's our circulation right there. Our systemic circulation is the portion of the cardiovascular system that carries oxygenated blood away from the heart. So it's our drop-off system. So we go from the heart to the body's cells, back to the heart. Heart, cells, cells, heart. That's our systemic circulation. Pulmonary pickup, heart, lungs, heart. Systemic is drop off, heart, cells, heart. Here's a bit more of a detailed diagram of that. You can have a look at that in your revision. That might help you with the whole blood through the system. And here's just a little graph of blood flow to different parts of the body during exercise or at rest. So red is at rest. So while we're resting, there's a pretty even distribution of blood flow to these different spaces. So brain, cardiac muscle or heart, skeletal muscle, skin, abdominal organs, kidneys and other, and then you'll see during exercise it stays relatively the same except there's a massive increase in skeletal muscle, which makes sense, requires more ATP production, which requires more oxygen, and you'll also have an increase in blood flow to the skin, which, as we know through thermoregulation, makes sense also. There is heat generated as a byproduct of exercise. We need to get rid of that. Vessels in our skin dilate, increase blood flow to the skin. Okay, that's it, team. Again, don't panic. We'll revisit this in the tutorial. Watch some of the videos. The self-directed task will help, and just keep chipping away.